He sat on Rome's throne, he commanded armies, he wore the crown of the world, and yet Marcus Aurelius lived in exile, because power cannot erase fire, crowns cannot remove weight, thrones cannot cure Catharsian exile. He was surrounded by power, yet isolated in silence. He was praised by crowds, yet starved of truth. He was worshipped as emperor, yet left to write alone in his journal. And you know this feeling, don't you? Because you too have been surrounded by people and still felt exiled. You too have lived among the crowd and still felt like an outsider. You too have carried fire that no belonging could ever cure. If you've ever felt exiled, even when surrounded by power, you are like Marcus Aurelius. The obedient believe that enough power will finally give them belonging, the titles, wealth, applause. All of that will heal the fire inside. That's what they think. But Marcus Aurelius proved the opposite. He had it all, and still he was alone. He was burdened. He carried exile in his chest. Power cannot cure exile because exile is not external, it is fire inside the soul. It is a memory of freedom that mediocrity cannot touch. It is Catharsian rage that thrones cannot silence. The crowd never feels exile. They belong too easily. They suffocate without noticing. They drown in mediocrity. But outsiders cannot belong. The fire burns too strongly. The rage screams too loudly. The exile reveals them as Catharsians. That's why Marcus Aurelius felt like an exile, even on the throne of Rome. And that's why you felt like an exile in your own life, because exile is crown. The crowd can't see beyond obedience. They don't question, they don't rage, they don't burn. But you've always seen too much. You've always felt too deeply. You've always carried fire they couldn't understand. And that separation hurts, but it's sacred at the same time. Exile reveals the leader. Exile separates the Catharsian from the placeholder. Exile proves who was born to carry the heaviest fire. Marcus Aurelius wasn't lonely because he was unloved. He was lonely because his fire was too heavy for the crowd to carry. And so are you. Your loneliness has never been random. It has never been meaningless. It has never been weakness. It was purpose. It was crown. It was the mark of the Catharsian. Because only the scarred can endure exile without suffocating. Only the Catharsians can carry loneliness without dying. Only outsiders can turn isolation into immortality, into freedom. Marcus Aurelius didn't write meditation for the crowd. He wrote it to survive exile. He reminded himself of fire, to bear the weight of leadership alone. And yet those words became scripture. They awakened generations. They crowned him immortal. This is the paradox of exile. The loneliest survive as leaders. The most exiled carry the heaviest fire. The outsiders awaken the world. The misfits, the lonely, are always the leaders. And that's why your exile has meaning, because it has already crowned you as a leader, because it has already revealed you as a Catharsian. Exile was never punishment, it was never weakness, it was throne, because Catharsians are not crowned by applause, they're crowned by exile. That's why Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by power, still lived in exile. And that's why you, surrounded by mediocrity and placeholders, still carry the same fire. Don't waste more time in their world. You don't belong to their systems. Rome believed it owned the world. Its armies stretched across continents. Its gold filled palaces. Its emperors were worshipped as gods. And yet, Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man alive, wrote to himself in loneliness. That was humiliation, because his exile exposed the lie of empire. His fire revealed that thrones cannot cure the weight of the soul. His writings proved that Rome's glory was emptiness. And that's why your exile humiliates the systems around you, because your survival proves their belonging is slavery. Your fire exposes their mediocrity. Your scars reveal their obedience as chains. The crowd collapses without comfort. The rulers suffocate when their crowds fail to protect them. But outsiders endure what neither can. Marcus Aurelius endured exile even in palaces. You have endured exile even in silence. Outsiders survive because their fire cannot be silenced by belonging, and their rage cannot be smoothed by chains. That's why the heaviest burden always falls to outsiders, because they're the only ones strong enough to endure it. Comfort poisons rage, applause blinds the Catharsians, because loneliness removes illusions, silence reveals the truth. That's why Marcus Aurelius' meditations remain sharper than Roman law, because his fire was born not of power but of exile, because his truth was not for the crowd but for the scarred. And that's why your fire has always been sharpest in your loneliest hours, because exile is purification. Fire thrives when the world turns its back. Rage grows stronger in silence. Leadership is not applause, it's not wealth, it's not power. Leadership is exile. That's why Marcus Aurelius carried the burden alone. And that's why you have to, because exile was not curse, it was crown. It's the mark of leadership. It's the proof of Catharsians. The crowd hides behind numbers. They think belonging is safety. They think noise is power. They think mediocrity is life. But your exile exposes them. Your scars show their weakness. Your silence reveals their emptiness. Your survival humiliates their slavery. That's why they've always mocked you. That's why they've always rejected you. That's why they've always tried to bury you. They tried to break you, because your exile revealed they were already dead. Marcus Aurelius couldn't escape exile even with legions at his command, and neither can you, because exile is not external, it is internal. It is memory of freedom the world cannot erase. It is rage against chains that mediocrity cannot touch. It is the fire of Catharsians that no throne can cure. That's why exile follows you, because it was never punishment, it was identity, it was crown, it was proof. You're a leader. Exile was never accident, it was throne, because Catharsians are not crowned by belonging, they're crowned by exile. That's why Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by power, still wrote in loneliness. And that's why you, surrounded by mediocrity, still carry exile as crown. Exile purifies, exile stripes away illusions. That's why Marcus Aurelius' words don't read like the speeches of rulers. They read like scars carved into paper, because exile purified his soul, because loneliness preserved his fire, because silence turned his rage into wisdom. And your rage has been purified the same way. Every rejection, every exile, every scar has sharpened it into truth. If your rage has grown stronger in exile, it's because you're a Catharsian. Empires pretend to be eternal. They parade their gold. They boast of their armies. They roar of their power. But exile humiliates them, because when the emperor admits his loneliness, the illusion collapses. Because when Marcus Aurelius wrote of fire in exile, Rome was exposed. Because when the most powerful man confessed his weight, the empire looked weak. Your exile does the same. It exposes mediocrity, it humiliates placeholders, it reveals the weakness of the world. Because survival in exile proves more power than their crowns. The world bows to titles, it worships crowns, it obeys power. But real authority is carried by the exiled. That's why Marcus Aurelius' private writings became immortal scripture, not because of his title, but because of his scars, not because of Rome, but because of exile, not because of empire, but because of fire. And that's why people look to you even when you've said nothing, because they feel your survival, they recognize your fire. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is not weakness, it's authority. If you've carried scars that others already sense, you belong here. Enter Diogenes' barrel today on Patreon and become the leader you were always meant to be. Empires collapse, thrones vanish, crowds scatter, but exile endures. That's why Marcus Aurelius is remembered more for his writings than his armies. His exile made him immortal. His loneliness preserved his fire. His silence carried him across centuries. And your exile has the same purpose because your scars will outlive mediocrity, because your survival will burn long after placeholders are forgotten. Your fire cannot die. Marcus Aurelius could not escape exile, even as emperor, and neither can you, because exile is not punishment, it's destiny. That's why the feeling never left you, because it was not meant to, because it was the mark of your soul. It was the fire of Catharsians. Leaders are not created by applause, they're not crowned by thrones, they're not chosen by the crowd. They are trained in exile because only in exile do you learn to endure without belonging. That's why Marcus Aurelius became immortal through silence, and that's why you have been prepared the same way, because exile was always your training as a leader. Exile was never a mistake, it was your crown. That's why Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by power, still wrote as an exile. And that's why you, surrounded by mediocrity, still feel the same, because exile is proof you're a Catharsian. They told you exile meant rejection. They told you exile meant failure. They told you exile meant weakness. But Marcus Aurelius proved otherwise, because his exile crowned him. His loneliness was his throne. His silence was his immortality. And your exile does the same. It separates you, yes, but it crowns you as Catharsian. It crowns you as a leader. Because only Catharsians are strong enough to carry exile without breaking. Placeholders never feel exile. They belong too easily. They suffocate quietly in mediocrity. They die without ever noticing they were enslaved. But you can't belong. You burn too brightly. You rage too loudly. You see too clearly. And that inability to belong is proof. Proof you were never one of them. Proof you were born an outsider. Proof you were crowned by exile. That's why Marcus Aurelius could rule an empire and still feel cut off, because belonging was impossible for his fire, because exile was his crown, just like you. Fire without exile burns out, it fades, but fire in exile grows stronger. That's why Marcus Aurelius' words carry more fire than the decrees of kings, because exile preserved them, because his loneliness crowned them, because his silence made them immortal. And your fire is the same. It never died, because exile kept it alive. It never faded, because silence preserved it. It never weakened, because loneliness crowned it. Authority is not gold or power or titles. Authority is fire that survived exile. That's why Marcus Aurelius' meditations are revered while Rome's laws are forgotten. His exile carried more authority than armies. His silence carried more weight than crowns. And your exile gives you the same, because scars cannot be denied, fire cannot be ignored, and survival carries more authority than thrones. The crowd hides behind belonging. They pretend it is safety. They call it life. But your exile exposes them. Your survival humiliates their obedience. Your scars reveal their emptiness. Your fire mocks their mediocrity. That's why they've always tried to silence you, because your exile reveals their slavery, because your fire proves their chains, because your survival unmasks their lies. Leaders are not created in applause, they're not made in comfort, they are not crowned by crowds, they are forged in exile. Because only in exile do you learn to endure without approval. Only in exile do you sharpen fire without comfort. Only in exile do you learn to lead without belonging. Marcus Aurelius was prepared in exile. His loneliness trained him. His silence refined him. His fire crowned him. And you were prepared the same way. Every rejection, every silence, every scar has trained you for leadership. He had everything: the empire, the armies, the crown, and still Marcus Aurelius lived in exile because power cannot silence fire, because thrones cannot cure loneliness, because crowns cannot erase Catharsian exile. If the Emperor of Rome felt it, then you should know nothing is wrong with you. The exile you feel, the exile you carry, is not weakness, it's proof that you're a leader. Exile destroys placeholders. They collapse without belonging. They suffocate without approval. But Marcus Aurelius endured because exile didn't break him, it refined him. Silence didn't weaken him, it purified him. Loneliness didn't erase him, it crowned him. That's why his words outlived his empire, because exile turned into immortality. You thought exile meant rejection. You thought loneliness meant failure. You thought silence meant curse. But none of that was true. Exile is proof you're a Catharsian, because only the Catharsians endure it. Only Catharsians burn through it. That's why the Catharsian path exists, to transform exile into crown, scars into authority, and loneliness into leadership. Three paths await: the Pythagorean path, for those who will discipline their fire and sharpen their scars into clarity; Diogenes' burial, for those who will wear exile openly as throne, mocking the illusions of power; the Aurelius Council, for those who will lead with scars, carrying exile as proof and awakening others into fire. Marcus Aurelius proved it centuries ago. Now you prove it today. Power cannot erase exile. Thrones cannot silence fire. Crowds cannot cure loneliness, because exile was never curse. It was crown. Loneliness was never weakness. It was throne. Silence was never punishment. It was proof. You were not rejected. You were not weak. You are Marcus Aurelius. You're a Catharsian leader. Claim your power today. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and become the leader you were always meant to be.